Hey, good evening, everyone. This is Lowman02. Hey, we're going to do a quick run through of the Storm deck again, as I've done a little bit of additional building on the on this deck specifically. So one of the problem sets that I've been trying to solve with this deck is how do you beat red deck wins? And an epiphany kind of came to me in the form of Madcap Experiment and Platinum Empyrean. Um, so we do run 5 artifacts in the deck, which actually equates out pretty well to our board plan. So if we do end up going against them on our red deck wins, we can still use the blue blast package plus Madcap Experiment and Platinum Empyrean. My thinking is obviously Platinum Empyrean is like the worst ever to draw in this deck. I mean, yeah, I guess you could like hard cast him out with like all the mana production. Um, but what you'd hate to have see happen is to see him get blown up, the turn you put him into play, and it's frankly terrible against any other matchup, I think. Um, but their removal suite, I mean, like they're looking to spend 3 cards to remove this guy, unless they have very cheap artifact hate, which some of them do run the Smash of Smithereens. It's obviously the worst answer for a card like Platinum Empyrean. But I think more often than not, they tend not to run that. They tend to run like a card like what is it, Fiery Confluence, which can get him, etc. So with this kind of package here against Mono Red, am I thinking this could be a viable package? 3 of them, reactive, and 2 of them very proactive, or really one of them, Madcap Experiment. If you don't have Platinum Empyrean in hand, is very proactive against them. What we end up losing is the Baleful Strix, which is, honestly, it's fine in the deck. The deck tends to fix blue and black much easier than red mana, as his requirements are far less for it. Penthead Prism, honestly fine. So, this deck revolves around Mana Flare and High Tide, or really any way to make lands tap for more. I mean, I guess a much worse version would be Rain and Filth. But any way that allows lands to tap for more, this deck revolves around. So, during the turn you're actually winning. The only reason you ever use Pentad Prism is really to fix mana. Like make more red or make more black to cast your game winning spell. Lotus Petal and Chromox. Chromox, I'm starting to kind of come off anyways. Lotus Petal is nice because it helps with Doomsday piles to a large extent. And then Candelabra, is a tough loss because once you are winning the game, once you have cast a Tide or have a Mana Flare effect in play, like Candelabra, just it's doubling cube for 1 mana. Which is awesome. I mean, it's not quite doubling cube, but the card I think is more applicable if you want to fix in like the early game as well. Like a card like doubling cube, which is kind of just like shoddy unless you're already winning. Um, so that's kind of the thinking that we had as we built this board. Another couple of things we ended up adding Dark Blast in here. I forget what we ended up taking out for it, but the realization came to me: this card is epically great in this deck. It's a good board card. So like you're facing like White Weenie or something like that, which we're gonna show one match this evening, and that ends up being what it was. And this ended up being kind of a prescient add to the deck. It doesn't really come into play. We cast it once, but really only generate storm count. But I think it's great against that matchup. And like, if you think of matchups that tend to beat this deck, it's going to be, stacks or, death and taxes type decks. Decks that have the ability to take away the advantages, looking to accrue in mana. And obviously card draw as well. And white tends to be pretty hateful and good at that. Toxic Deluge still in here, and then Massacre was another ad. We took out the Thought Lash, kind of to make room for some of these hate cards, as well as the Empyrean Madcap Experiment kind of combo that we can go into against some red deck wins. So that's kind of where we're standing right now. You won't get to see the crazy Madcap Experiment at this point, but we ended up playing Johnny Rogue again. And he again was on Death and Taxes. Maybe he was expecting that we'd be on this deck, because I think his matchup against this deck is actually fairly favorable. So his first hand is fine. We have 3 lands, which we're happy to see. Oh, one thing I failed to note before we jump into this match is in the actual deck itself. We ended up doing what we said we were going to do yesterday. We took out the Mox Diamond, and then just put an additional basic land. So we put an additional island, and then we also cut the mountain in the deck and put an additional snow island in for a total of 10 basic islands, 5 of which are snow, 5 of which are just standard islands. And that's so that we still have a little bit of game with Tainted Pact. Obviously, this makes Tainted Pact a little bit worse But I found the deck, today I've fished the deck quite a bit, and it runs a lot better with 29 lands, without the diamond. The diamond is just dead so often. It's only really good once you're already winning the game. So we play out a Blitz Mire. We see an Elite Vanguard, and we're thinking in our head, all right, well, our plan is probably going to be to repeal that when it attacks in next turn. And if we get lucky, he'll like enchant it or put a piece of equipment on it. We don't get that lucky, but we get to repeal it. We draw Rain and Filth, which is going to be a good late game card. Now we see Thalia, and we're like, eesh. But our draw is significantly good as well. So we get a Mana Flare, and we figure if we can get that down, we can just the raw mana advantage that Mana Flare will accrue us is just going to beat Thalia. It plays out the Elite Vanguard again. We just pitch the Thalia back to hand so we can cast our Mental Note, because we're looking to hit land drops here. Because we want to do is we want to get, yeah, we cast the deck, and unfortunately we miss again. The Mana Flare, is not as relevant to us, and neither is the Thalia, because we have the Mana Flare as hitting our lands. Now, we see a really bad thing. I mean, obviously, this is terrible for us. Winter Orb tends to beat us. Now, what our game plan becomes is how do, we play out the Cloud of Fate because we want to get one more deck activation. I find a Turnabout, which is a great card here. So we're thinking, all right, we got to cast out our Mana Flare. We're going to let our deck die, use the Cloud of Fate to block, ideally the Quarter Paladin on this next turn. Now, we obviously can't tap out for our Portent because we need 5 mana to cast our Turnabout. But once we do, I feel like it's going to be very difficult to lose. And we can't here. We think we can, but we can't. We're like, darn it, Thalia, we get, hit in again for another 4, and I believe he ends up playing out Banishing Light, which we're just like, ugh. But, we're playing a card like Mana Flare. I mean, what can you expect? So, and we're thinking in our head, we're like, oh, Cabal Therapy, you're just a couple turns too late. If we'd had you a couple turns ago, we definitely would have used the Cloud of, we would have definitely looked and then sacked the Cloud of Fate before that Winter Orb came down. So we could quite handily lose this one. Of note, like, we weren't far. So if we had available to us, either if we had the turn pass back to us with our Mana Flare in play, or if Thalia had not been in play the turn prior to this, we have this game. Because with Turnabout Snapcaster, we can turn about all of our lands, opening up our mana options, floating 1 off of the casting of Turnabout. Generate 10 mana, then cast a Snapcaster, which casts for an even 2 down to 8. And at that point, we can recast the Turnabout after tapping down, and that would put us up to 18 mana. At that point, with everything tapped down, and with 18 mana, very well fixed mana, we can ostensibly Doomsday, into a pretty decent pile. Now, what we'd have to do when we Doomsday is kind of an awkward Doomsday pile. And actually, let me think through if we can do it. Yeah, so what we'd end up having to do is we would Doomsday pile. We'd already have pitched the Turnabout and the Snapcaster. We'd cast Cabal Ritual, targeting ourselves. Discard the Portent to salvage mana, because we don't really need it. And then we would be not Hellbent, but we would be at 1 card in hand, Infernal Tutor. Casting that, we would go Hellbent at that point in time. And we would essentially use a tutor to draw into our pile, putting us down to 4 cards in the library, casting Meditate. Upon casting of Meditate, cast Laboratory Maniac, and then cast Gitaxian Probe, you name cantrip, and that would have been the game. But unfortunately, we're 1 mana short the turn prior, and we've lost our Mana Flare this turn. We just can't do it. So let's go to the second 2 matches, because we end up taking this one and the third game is very close. Okay, so, we look at this hand, we're like, hey, this is a good hand against aggro. I mean, so we have Thing in the Ice, which is going to stave off the early ground beats. We have a mid-game play in the Mana Flare. We have a fetch land plus a Brainstorm, which is very powerful. And we also have decent card draw and Thirst for Knowledge. And if we can ever hit one of our 5 artifacts and pitch it, outside of Candelabra, because Candelabra is just going to be too good, we're going to have to keep that with Mana Flare. For production, we're in a good spot. So we end up keeping it, play on our islands, we can't get Wasteland. We see a Mox Diamond, we're like, ooh, fast starts. See a Selfless Spirit, play on our Thing in the Ice, get attacked for 2. He ends up playing out, and this card just is bad. So I do play this Hate Bear in my Death and Taxes build as well. The card's great. Great card. And I don't know how relevant it is in our format because I think I'm the only person I've seen in 100 card singleton that actually plays Storm or tries to play Storm. I'm not saying it's great, but I think we're the only ones to try to play it. So what we do here is a bit of baiting. We don't think he has the 3 damage, the fire bolt that only hits creatures, or the lightning bolt that only hits creatures from white from Time Spiral. We just don't. We're gonna play into it. It's fine because really the thing in the ice is not our plan. So we play the Mana Flare, and what our thinking is here is we just do the Massacre. The Massacre is just a massive beating against White Laney, and we're glad we have it in the board. Um, and we know he has a Glow Rider, and we know he has the Sarah Avenger. The Sarah Avenger, obviously, Massacre doesn't get, but we just plan on wiping his board. So we just get rid of 2 significant hate bears, bounce back his Sarah Avenger, and then just start going ham. We knock out a Brave the Elements, whatever. At some point, actually, it does become a little relevant because, with the mana advantage we're also giving him, because Mana Flare is a parallel effect, he's able to cast down his hand. But we've gotten the relevant cards that just beat us because we need our graveyard, and we really don't want to pay 1 more for everything, even with a Flare in play. So what we end up doing is we cast out a Mystical Teachings that's going to our graveyard, getting a Snapcaster. Snapcaster is like, well, I mean, I don't know, that sounds stupid. I mean, Snapcaster is just great. And he's great in this deck, is really that's what I mean to say. Like, he goes from like a 10 to, I don't know what's above that, in this deck. Because in and of himself, he can essentially generate, like, I think it's 4 or 5 Storm count, if you have one of, like, the Repeal or Snap effects. And in this deck, he's a mana advantage engine plus a card advantage engine and a storm engine. So we draw pretty well in Cloud of Fae. We end up tapping to produce blue and red and black, or blue and red. Cast down our Goblin Electromancer over the top of the Cloud of Fae. And as you can see, we're using Cloud of Fae plus Snapcaster plus Repeal to just generate, a huge storm count. So I mean, like, as you can see, like this is what Snapcaster can do. We use the Diabolic Intent, I believe, getting Tendrils, and we don't do anything fancy. We don't go for, like, any graveyard shenanigans. We just do it pure and simple, and Tendrils him out for, I believe, Xaxes. I think he was a -1. And we could have gone higher. I mean, this deck, like, if you want to, as I think some people would call it, FAP with the deck, you can definitely do that. This deck, and I've tried it just when I'm fishing, just to see if I can burn through the whole deck, and you can. Like, at this point, we probably could burn through the whole deck, given the Diabolic Intent. And what that would have involved is, as opposed to getting Tendrils, getting Past in Flames. But the one weakness to that is, although we do have an Infernal Tutor to also back it up, is we don't have good mana production inside our graveyard, and we don't have like a card like Yawgmoth's Will that would allow us to recast the Cloud of Fae, which is a good mana production card. So that's the game for the second round. And this game is dicey. This is a close one. I think we play pretty well though. So like, I think we ditch the Peer into Mists. It's a draw 1. It's a blind draw 1. So I pitched that one because I think I'd rather cast Serum Visions turn 1, and then I'm ideally hitting a land. And that's not the best card for. I mean, that card can hit you land, but it's not the best. So we see an Isamaru, which, like, just, the 1-drops are just, a lot of people will, like, laugh at cards like Isamaru. Like, Isamaru, maybe they won't, but, like, I think some people do. Like, Isamaru is just a huge time beating. Like, the 1-drops in the Death and Taxes deck are really, I think, underrated by a lot of folks. So the name of our game is this. We have an Infernal Tutor in hand, and the reason we're pitching cards to, like, because Chromebox normally wouldn't cast at this point, but the name of our game has kind of become, all right, we need to make land drops every turn, and we do pretty good at this. We need to make land drops every turn, and we need to eventually Infernal Tutor for our Time Spiral and rebuild our hand when we're on a boat of mana. Because like I think said before, like, this deck can win generally very easily once it's on 6 mana, and if it has a full grip of cards, it can do that very well. So he starts casting out threats. I believe he leaves up a mana to plow this, which, I kind of knew was coming. I figured it was plow because when he didn't recast out the other 2/2, the Cathar, I figured he was on a plow. Because normally if it was like a card like, what is it called? Swords to Plowshares, you wouldn't wait until my turn because, I'm on blue. I guess I could counter it. So, yeah, we're just digging for lands. You can see we're just pitching everything in the bottom, digging for lands. We get cast this out, get our Time Spiral. White doesn't have discard, so I'm not too worried about it. Plus, I kind of have to. I'm going to die. Like, I'm dying very fast in this game. We get very lucky. He doesn't have another piece of equipment to equip up the Angel to beat us to death. So we got down to 1 life, and he plays on his Cathar. He's done 2 cards. We don't know what they are at this point. He asks us, time spiral. We say, yeah, Roger, we're on the spiral. We're spinning it around. So we end up spinning it. We can't use that land because we're at 1 life. So here's an interesting play. So I don't know if you saw it, it was kind of quick, but we pitch a Verdant Catacombs, which is obvious. We can't use the Verdant Catacombs, it kills us. We also pitch the blue-black filter land. And the reason being is, this hand, we're on 3 storm count right now. This hand in and of itself, you know, with my knowledge that I have right now, does not generate enough storm. So what I'm thinking is, okay, one, I can't have 2 lands on top, period, because when I go to peak, one, I don't want to anticipate into 2 lands. I want to put them on the bottom, because if I anticipate and I find 3 lands, that's terrible, especially when one of them I can't use, and who knows if I'll find another fetch land. I can't peak, because I'll peek into one of the 2 lands, and I need to use the peek and the anticipate as engines to find myself additional spells at this point. So I don't want to find lands with them anymore. I want to find spells. Um, so, what the issue with this hand becomes is I have a ton of blue mana. I have a decent bit of red mana, but I'm very light on black mana. And I'm on Storm Count 3. He's on 20 life, so I need to, at a minimum, get to Storm Count 9 to win. All this hand in and of itself right now does is generate 5 Storm Count. I think it's highly reasonable to expect that Anticipate will generate, at a minimum, 1 more Storm Count to 6. And realistically, if I can look at the top 3, I can generate 7 because I can find another cantrip with the amount of mana I have available. But what the friction point becomes is that I need to also fix my mana for black. I needed a minimum 2 black mana to fix for tendrils. I'm only on 1 right now. So really what I'm hunting for is either the Pentad Prism, the Cabal Ritual, the Dark Ritual, or the Rain and Filth. So those cards, and I have not, keep in mind I have not made my land drop yet. But at the same time, I also know that I can't win this turn if I do make that land, or correction, if I do utilize that land, because the other thing I could be looking for is the high tide as well. And the blue mana is going to serve me better than the filter land. That's one of the awkward things about the filter lands in this deck, and maybe they warrant replacement due to that, is that they don't play well with tide specifically. So that's kind of the rationale behind getting rid of that land. So we end up finding the Thought Scour, which is a great find. We're glad to have gotten rid of those 2 lands. We draw a worthless land at this point. So we end up going for the Desperate Ritual to generate additional mana that we can use for the colorless and Anticipate. Find Rain and Filth, and we're just cheering. Cast the Rain and Filth, cast the Peak, see his hand. Irrelevant. Find the Dark Blast, which you could find. We cast out the Dark Blast and then Tendrils for lethal. I'm sorry, we peek and then we draw the Dark Blast, because we know if we peek and we draw the Dark Blast, that is a spell we can cast given the mana off Rain and Filth, which means we don't have to burn through our mana casting Toxic Deluge, which we could cast, but we couldn't cast to do any damage. We cast it for 0 life. And I guess it still would have played around, Mana Tithe, because we'd have 1 additional floating. But that's how we ended up playing it out. We ended up, I think, getting a reward. I think we did play that properly. I don't think we wanted that filter land. I think we have more ounce, and there's additional ounce that I haven't even mentioned. Like you have, Rain and Folk already mentioned. You have the Moxen. I'm sorry, the Mox already in play. The Diamond had come out at this point. You also have Lotus Petal that's in there. And then the other card that I'm thinking in my head is Manamorphose, which can fix for 2 black mana at that point as well. And there's probably a couple more that I'm failing to think through right now. But that's kind of where we're going with it. That's kind of how we're thinking is, we know that there are good odds that we can get there with this hand. We end up, I think, playing it correctly, and we do. So very good games against Johnny Rogue. This last game was a nail biter because obviously, whenever you're spiraling or what is it, time twistering essentially, for lack of better terms, you're rolling the dice, and then it's a new puzzle box that you have to solve. And the one non-bow with that card in this deck specifically, if you kind of watch the previous ones, is that we tend to rely very heavily on our graveyard. That's the this is the only time I think I've seen almost more lands than spells in our graveyard. But it's a Past in Flames deck, so this is how it ended up playing out. And I do think Spiral is good in the deck, and I think it was one of the few cards that gave me an out. In this game, we were just getting beat viciously by a bunch of white weenies. But luckily, we managed to luck out this last game. We didn't get hated out by Glow Riders and Thalias and whatever that Pegasus thing is that does the same thing. So good games against Johnny Rogue. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if this is a format that interests you, I hope you'll join the community that we have. We play every Saturday in a player-run event on Magic Online. It's called the Chainsaw Massacre. If you're interested in playing this format and understanding what its ban lists are and what some of the decks to beat are and what decks folks generally tend to play, go to gatherling.com. I say again, gatherling.com, and check out under one of the events, Chainsaw Massacre. There is a link page that goes to MTG Salvation, and there's a bunch of diatribe in there, plus a ban list on the page one. Very fun format. In a lot of ways, it's similar to Commander, in that it has 100 cards. Outside of that, it's really not the same because we started obviously 20 life, and you don't have a recurring spell, plus a bunch of probably dead cards without the Commander in your deck. So decks like White Weenie, are very viable, or Death Attacks are very viable. Red deck, Burn or Red deck Wins is very viable. Actually, one of the least viable is probably the deck I'm playing, but this has kind of been a grail for me to make this deck more consistent. And the last four matches we played, we've gone 3-4 with it. And I kind of like our plan we have right now against Red deck Wins. I'm not sure how viable it is. It may just be more cool than viable. But who knows? The deck does have a lot of manipulation, a lot of ways to take cards out of its hand, put it back into the library, and also a lot of ways to get after the right cards at the right time. Which, if we thought, Madcap Experiment into a Platinum Imperium was the right answer at that time, then we could do it. Because I think if we do ever cast that lug, or if we do ever get that lug in play, it'll buy us enough time. Because all this deck's looking for is time. Because I think against a deck like Red Deck Wins, like if this deck can't get hit for life, um, it can't lose because it's if it can just sit there for 3 or 4 turns and just manipulate the top deck and manipulate the deck, eventually it's going to find a way to win. That's what it does. It manipulates, and draws through basically every cantrip that's illegal in the format. So very fun match, and I hope to see anyone who has watched this and is interested in the format on this next Saturday for the 100 card singleton event, the Chainsaw Massacre. Okay, I appreciate your time and have a great day.